Kia ora everybody, we'll just allow a minute for the numbers to build up a bit before I start off with the karakia. Kia ora everybody, no mai haere mai. Welcome to our Aotearoa Property Data Network webinar for September, where we are going to be peeking behind the property data curtain a little bit. I will start with the karakia and then run through the agenda and what we've got lined up for you today. So to the karakia. Te mata tātou, whaia te mataoranga, kia marama, kia tupu, kia tiaki nā whenua, nā moana, nā arawai, kia whai take nā mahi katoa, araha atu, araha mai, tātou ia tātou, toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi tū te whenua, homie, huie, tai kie. Kia ora. Right, so the agenda for today, first up we have Greer O'Donnell from the Open Advisory, who is going to be talking about the NZ's housing survey that they launched earlier this year, and wanted to raise awareness of that and really get a strong response rate to help understand the desires of people housing in New Zealand and what's in the way and what we could do better. Kāinga Ora and GBS will follow that with a talk about a case study of some work they did exploring title memorials and understanding rights of first refusal around projects and potential projects. And then we've got two LINZ presentations to finish, a Memorials 101 with Patrick Griffin from our property rights team, who's going to be talking just the basics really, a grounding in titles memorials, and then Nick Donnelly from our Geodesy team talking about Quasars and how they connect to property data. So some housekeeping. Audience, you are able to turn on your cameras and microphones. They're not restricted in this webinar, and we do encourage questions. Just pop up a hand or put them in the chat. There will be time after each of the presentations for a bit of Q&A, and so yeah, if you do just drop it in the chat, we can come to it, or if you pop up a hand, you can speak up. We'll throw to you, and we'll have a chat. Some of you may see a Q&A button, some may not. We're hearing feedback that that doesn't work in every webinar. It seems to be a Microsoft Teams issue. So the chat function should be a general feature that everyone should be able to see. So do encourage you to pop them there. And just a final thing, the webinar is being recorded and it will be shared after the event, after the transcription's been tidied up. In a few days after, we'll mail out to everyone to share that transcription, to share that recording. And so that brings us to the first of our presentations today with Greer O'Donnell from the Urban Advisory. Greer is a co-founder and managing director of the Urban Advisory with 13 years experience working in housing and urban development. With a diverse background in law and the social sciences, Greer brings a unique perspective to the built environment profession. Greer has led the design and delivery of various pieces of research focused on delivering healthier and more equitable homes, neighbourhoods, towns and cities. And today Greer is talking about, as I said earlier, the housing survey that was launched earlier this year. Take it away, Greer.
Kia ora, thanks for the introduction, Ben. So hopefully you can see my screen all right. So kia ora tātou, ko Greer O'Donnell taku ingoa, ko Whanganui aho. I am a Managing Director at the Urban Advisory, and just for those of you who are unaware of who the Urban Advisory is, we're a small company based in Tānaki. We work all over the motu and we do a range of different things, but housing is one of our favourite topics, and we're really on a mission to create healthier and more equitable homes, neighbourhoods, towns and cities, and we bring together different skills. So some of those include urban design and research and infrastructure and property advisory, but it's a real mixture, and that gives us, we think, a unique perspective. Why have we launched into this housing survey project? Well, we all know the issues. We all know the global importance and the local importance of housing and the environments that we live in. And we also know that meaningful participation and people having a say and people being able to participate in the conversation and ideally the solutions leads to better outcomes. So we've always been needing to use a lot of different types of data for the work that we do at the Urban Advisory, and often there isn't the data available that we would like. And so we've had the opportunity to do bespoke pieces of research or engagement and get a range of different insights. And it's through that process that over the last 8 or 9 years, we've really thought there's a missing piece in the data sets that we have available. And of course, we all know that the state of our housing system is pretty grim. So instead of being, I guess, we tried to put a positive thing on it. So what could we spin on it? So what could we do to contribute to a healthier and more equitable housing system? And our answer was the housing survey. So this is only one of the many things we need to do to improve the conversations that we have around the data that's available in terms of what people might want or need out of their housing, and is of course not a silver bullet. And we have put it into practice several times as we've been working over the years, and we've iterated on various different formats, and we've come up with a structure and a survey which we think captures a range of views, a broad range of perspectives, and the data can be used in a broad range of ways. So it's not perfect, and there will always be the need for other research and more specific targeted data for specific purposes, but we are wanting to contribute this to the general discourse and hope that it encourages others to think about the demand side of housing, not just the supply side. So we hear a lot about the fact we need more houses, but what type of houses and what are the options that people would consider if they were available. Currently, we have, quite a two-dimensional housing market in that we have market-owned homes and rentals, and then we have a splattering of other community housing, affordable housing, the odd co-housing project. Papa Kāinga is obviously on the rise, but we also have a real underrepresentation of a range of different tenures that exist internationally. And so we wanted to understand what people really wanted out of their housing and start to paint a picture of what a potential housing system for Aotearoa that is uniquely serves the people of Aotearoa could look like. And here's just a little example of the mix match or potential mix match, because we don't actually know the answers, between the sort of supply and demand side of the conversation. So just because what we're building makes sense economically and commercially, does it actually serve the people? Does it allow people to live in a way that enhances their quality of life? And so these are some of the questions that we were asking when we designed the survey. And we have going to have a few snippets of the results, but less so the insights for this particular presentation, because we've just got the first round of responses back. So we haven't had time to really deeply dive into the data for this session, but we'll give you a sneak peek. In fact, you're probably the first audience that will see any of the data results. So the things we were really interested in, understanding more about housing choice, spatially the differences across regions, between cities and towns, and those who don't live in an urban environment. We really wanted to look forward and think about preferences, which is really challenging from a data gathering perspective, and we've got a combination of both revealed and stated preferences for those of you who are interested in the methodology. And we asked around people's financial situation, which we worked through a range of ethics considerations, because we felt it was important to understand that perspective so we could make or draw insights around affordability. And that has meant that some groups and organisations are unwilling to share the survey, and because of those ethics. But we've had a really strong response rate, and it's all fully opt-in. So I think people have actually felt comfortable enough to provide that information, which has been really insightful. So there's also a series of questions about the level of satisfaction, which, spoiler alert, not many people are very satisfied with their housing that is available to them. And there is a series of questions around homelessness. So one of the things about the survey design is that it actually pipes you through slightly different questions depending on how you answer the survey. So if you've happened to take the survey yourself, you might think, oh, there was not questions about X, Y, or Z, and that's because perhaps the way that you answered the survey. And so there are slightly different questions depending on the situation that you find yourself in terms of your housing situation. Some of the use cases of the earlier versions of this survey included the Kapiti Coast District Council. We're a really awesome partner organisation. We were able to really deep dive into the potential of this type of data and did a really awesome process where the community themselves were able to draw on their own relationships and help us to gather the data. And so we got a really, really rich set of data from a real diverse range of people that was actually formed the basis of their housing strategy. And some of you might be aware that they've established recently a housing trust to deliver a range of different housing options. So there's some real tangible outcomes that can be achieved from having this deeper insight into what communities really want and need in their neighbourhoods. So another example for the planning oriented people in the room, the Dargaville Racecourse plan change. It was successful, and the previous racecourse is now going to be turned into a mixed, slightly industrial, but with a large component of residential. And a large part of the reason for the success of this plan change was because of the robust data and market engagement that we did, which really extended beyond the traditional market engagement, because it looked into a deep dive into the requirements of the aging population, for example, because that was an area that the council and the other stakeholders had identified as being needed. And so there was a really, really strong case to be made for this plan change, and the panel was really pleased with the information that we were able to present. And another of the use cases, we were really conscious that we have a large Māori population, they are Indigenous people, and we've had the chance to test this approach with iwi, with Ngāti Toa, and others, and also at a hapu level, and also at a non-affiliated, in a non-affiliated way, so with other organisations who represent Māori but are not iwi or hapu. And so in these particular use cases, the people we have worked with have really adapted it to be suitable for their own people and for their own context. And so while the New Zealand Housing Survey, the national version that is out in the world and will continue to be out in the world, it's going to be longitudinal, so we're going to keep it running, and hopefully we'll be able to see trends over time, but versions of it can be iterated on by different users so that they can get really what they need for their particular use. So obviously the housing survey covers a range of things that the census data does as well, and we compare it against the census data because that's currently the most reliable data set that we have. And without boring everybody to death, because most people are probably familiar with the census data, lots of questions in the census data about demographics, lots of questions around current housing, but actually very few questions about the future housing. So we've really tried to cover all aspects. And through having a broad range of questions, we can, when we get to that point, which we're still in the process of doing, we'll be able to really deep dive in and hopefully draw some insights when looking at the data against stats data. So quick comparison, stats is always going to have more detail across a broader range of things, but housing is about the same. Demographics, obviously stats data, much more detailed, but as I said, the sort of future perspective and looking at that demand side is something that we really want to add more robust information about, because currently, for those of you who don't know, most of our demand data is based on historical choices. So whether or not we have previously purchased a certain type of house, price points based on what's sold in the past. And of course, people can't buy what's not available, and people often aren't aware of the possible options because we don't know what we don't know. So we're going to shift now from kind of talking about the process and the approach to gathering information and have a quick whistle-stop tour through some of the results, not insights, because like I said, we haven't really had time to dig into it. It's more just the results. So on the face of it, they may say one thing, but when we produce the first report, it'll be a much more robust process to analyse the results. But I thought it was interesting to touch on some of the things that are showing up or appear to be showing up at this early stage. So huge range of responses from a real range of different people. Interestingly, many more females than males. Don't know what that actually says, but it's just a fun fact. Across a broad range of ages, and we did have someone over 90, so very impressed there. And obviously, if you've seen the media, the ageing population that we have has a huge housing need. So we've actually thought about some of the ways that we can engage those groups and other groups who might not have access to the digital version, so that we can look at creating hard copies and accessing some of those harder to access groups. So because it's going to be longitudinal and continue over time, we're really looking at all of the things that we can do to get the broadest range of people to respond. Ethnicity, that's interesting against those who have responded to the census and then those who have responded to this particular survey, but there is a good spread there. And again, we are thinking about the things we can do to make sure that we increase the participation of all ethnicities. Other ways that we were looking at breaking it down so that we can do the analysis to understand when we get to the next phase of preparing insights is how people, their households are configured and who they live with, and their, looking into whether or not there are trends or patterns that we can see for people who are living with, in particular, compositions or household configurations. The housing affordability piece is really difficult, obviously, to get a real clear view on, and there are a range of different methodologies for determining affordability. So we have considered those different options when we've been thinking about the questions that we've asked, and it won't come as any surprise to people that a lot of people actually, are not living in an affordable housing choice, or are not able to afford, as per the definition, which is generally accepted to be about 30% of your household income. And so associated with affordability is this notion of choice, and what you would prefer, what you can afford, and therefore what you choose, are interesting relationships between those things. And some of the things that often get left out of the conversation about housing affordability include your transport costs, or the cost of food, or your ability to access services in a timely and affordable manner. And so we've asked a range of questions about people's wider living arrangements, and have asked questions about why they would remain living in their current living arrangement, as opposed to being able to perhaps make a decision to live in a different way. And there's a real broad, as you would expect, range of responses back to the affordability piece. So, nearly over 60% of people at least slightly agree or strongly agree that they are concerned about their ability to pay for housing. And when we look into some more of the specific questions, there are some of these things that people have had to stop doing in order to be able to make ends meet and to prioritise their housing. And as you'll see, it paints a pretty dire picture. And I think what we really want to make clear to people is that, housing itself is so fundamental to all aspects of our life, and the affordability and availability of housing and appropriate housing in the right places is critical to all aspects of life. So skipping meals, and not visiting doctors, not having insurance, which we're seeing as becoming more and more of a big issue as we have increased natural hazards, etc. So there's a range of reasons around why people don't perceive housing to be affordable, and these perceptions-based questions are quite tricky to analyse. And there's, as I mentioned before, there's a series of stated preferences and then revealed preferences. But just what I thought was quite interesting was the fact that, a lot of people who own their own home actually don't necessarily want to or have to own their own home in the future. They could have a different preference, which is something that in New Zealand we really prioritise home ownership. And so hopefully when we dig into this data, we'll be able to add some more perspectives about the type of housing and whether or not ownership is the sole driver of our housing choices. There was quite a number of people who had mentioned that they would prefer to live in a collective housing agreement, such as a co-housing project. The reality of the people in that situation was quite low. And then, of course, as you would expect, the renting sector and the people renting, a lot of those people would have chosen to had the opportunity to own a home. So really have to dig into this some more and look at it across the demographics and across the regions to draw some sensible conclusions. But looking at typology, the standalone house, obviously that's a majority of people. The desire to live in a block of flats versus the reality is different, but a lot of the data would suggest that actually there's maybe not as much of a mixed match between preferences and reality from initial glances, so we'll need to dig into that. And housing satisfaction, which is interesting in the context of the previous point about the mixed match between, or potentially less of a mixed match than we initially thought between preferences and reality, but people are still, over half of people are still unsatisfied with their housing. So really understanding why and trying to dig into that. So that's it from me today. I didn't want to go too deep because, you know, there's a varied range of audiences in the room. But if you want to head along and help us increase the rate of responses, but also you know, for you to have your say and your input in what you think is important for us to be thinking about as we start looking through this first set of data. So it will be open continuously, but we have cut-off dates from the point of view of analysing the data. And so our cut-off date for this tranche of data will be probably about October, November. And then we're going to release the first full report early in 2025. So yeah, hope that was interesting and here for questions.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Greer. I just have an initial question. Is there anything so from this initial tranche and your first sort of look behind the data, is there anything that sort of stood out as surprised you in any way?
I think our hypothesis was that there would be a bigger discrepancy between people's realities and their preferences. But we haven't dug into the data, so we can't really understand exactly what that's saying yet. I wasn't surprised how many people were unsatisfied, and I was not surprised at the breadth of different housing options people selected in terms of whether they'd be interested in living in a different type of housing situation. So I think, yeah, nothing so far that's been super, super surprising, but watch this space.
Yeah. Do you think, you mentioned sort of early on that people don't know what they don't know when it comes to sort of different ways of living and options that are prevalent elsewhere in the world? Maybe it's just is it like reflects our isolation in a way, or what's been built has been built?
We made the presentation, the survey highly visual because with images to support the questions, so that people who didn't have a technical background, you know, when we're talking about typologies or tenures, we've tried to explain it in a way and demonstrate what we've explained using images and pictures to try and help broaden people's knowledge so that they can answer in a most fulsome manner. But there is definitely a real lack of knowledge about some of the more less known housing types. And so that's why one of the reasons why we want this to be longitudinal is that we think over time the trends will change as we get more of these different types of houses available and people's knowledge of them increases, and more so than their knowledge, their experiences of living in those different types. I mean, I often hear people who live in apartments, you know, because they had to, as opposed to because they chose to, talking about how great it is and how much, you know, they hadn't realized the benefits until they had the opportunity to experience it. And so I think there's a bit of a time that's going to take us to adapt. And I think the trends that we see in this kind of data will change over time.
Yeah, and do you think there's possibly a connection to tenure as well, right? Because it's the freehold section with a detached house seems to be that really popular option, and it's the most prevalent as you look around the Motu. It's just what's been built. It's the suburban dream, right?
Yeah, there's just a couple of questions there, or one in particular about how do people find the survey. So if you head, or you can scan the barcode, but if you head to the Urban Advisory website, it's probably the most easily searchable way to find the survey. There's a big orange button that you can go directly to the New Zealand Housing Survey, but the optimization is probably not as helpful as the Urban Advisory's website, so it should pop up more easily for you if you search the Urban Advisory.
I've just popped the link in the chat for everybody. Otherwise, as you said, that QR code is in the pack on your final slide when that's shared. Can you tell us how many people are living on Papa Kāinga, living within Māori collective ownership tenure? And is this an approach which more iwi groups are promoting?
I mean, we can't definitively tell you. We can tell you how many people who did the survey and live in that kind of situation. But we can't tell you collectively how many people are living in that housing tenure / typology across the country. I know that the likes of Te Matapihi, which is the housing body responsible for community housing and Māori housing and generally, they are trying to get an understanding of that. And it is a fluctuating number because there's lots of people who are trying, and there had been previous government funding to support the delivery of Papa Kāinga, and that's been put on hold. And so it is a really interesting part of the housing system. And we've only really been able to scratch the surface of it in this survey, but yeah, there are others working on that.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think that's it for the questions, and we're pressing on for time. So thanks again, Greer. Really appreciate you coming to share that survey, and really encourage everyone to answer the survey and share it as well, to really build up that, especially that gap with aspirations and for future housing needs. So it looks like it's really filling a need in the information space there. And I will just queue up the next presentation. It should resume. Next. Okay, now we have Kirsten Fryer and Mark Gladstone from Kāinga Ora and GBS, respectively, talking about a case study about title memorials and rights of first refusal. Kirsten is highly motivated to achieve the best outcomes for customers and stakeholders, and has focused for more than 20 years in the geospatial industry. She has a unique combination of experience and knowledge across GIS, project management, and community engagement within environmental consultancies, local and central government, both in New Zealand and overseas. And now, as Geospatial Advisor at Kāinga Ora, she also has oversight of the Geospatial strategic direction and enjoys building up the spatial capability across the agency. Mark has over 20 years in the geospatial industry as well, across New Zealand and the UK, in analyst and developer roles, especially. Since joining GBS in 2018, he's gained extensive experience in configuring and supporting ArcGIS enterprise environments. His other work has focused on clients' GIS needs, developing GIS strategies, standards and guidelines. Mark thrives on working with business partners and technical teams to deliver solutions with a keen interest in data standards, and deriving value from non-spatial information. So without much further ado, I believe Mark is starting off the presentation.
Right, Ben, are you able to see everything on the screen as it should be?
I can see the screen. If yourself and Kirsten would like to pop on cameras, that'd be terrific, so we can see yourselves as you present.
Unfortunately, I won't be able to do that. It's not a good angle, but anyway.
All good. Kirsten has popped on.
Yeah,
but we can hear you loud and clear, and we can see your presentation. That's awesome.
Excellent. Thanks for the intro. Hi, everyone. As Ben mentioned at the forum start, Patrick from LINZ will be giving a more likely comprehensive grounding on memorials themselves in a later session. So I'm just going to quickly run through what a memorial is as a bit of an introduction. And then I'll provide some examples for some of the category groupings into which I've classified memorial records and demonstrate why such categories and spatializing the data itself can be helpful. I'll then pass over to Kirsten to run through in more detail how treaty settlements data that we've extracted from memorials and spatialized were analysed against Kāinga Ora's own portfolio and project areas. So, what are memorials? They're an important part of the land title system in New Zealand and provide a textual record of the particular legal references, interests and obligations that are associated with land title. Hopefully that doesn't get contradicted in the later presentation, but anyway, some examples of the memorial text are presented in a somewhat simplified form in the table on the right of the slide. Hopefully people can squint and read some of the text. It comes from a data set sourced from the LINZ data service, and that data set contains over 29 million records. I have to acknowledge that the information presented in this table and in later slides have been derived from that memorials data from the LINZ data service. So it's licensed for use under Creative Commons license. Thanks, LINZ. And they have no inkling at all about what I've done with their data, and they certainly haven't endorsed what I've done, but hopefully they think that there's some value in it. So data classification. A memorial record is a summary of some interest in the title. And what can we do with that summary? What I've done is I've data mined the text of the table to extract and apply to the millions of records a unique set of data categories. Each summary record in its category has been spatialized to allow the presentation in a GIS map form. So some of the examples of the categories I've created are mortgage encumbrances. So those are the titles afflicted by a mortgage, very relevant to the housing presentation we just heard about. So in the map, you can see on the right, a section of Wellington, the colour coding reflecting the branding colours of New Zealand's main banks to which the mortgages are associated. We've also pulled out environmental conservation features such as national parks, reserves, marine reserves and wildlife sanctuaries where those are noted. Another category group is the public works orders, proclamations or similar, which are often the legalese where title is designated for public use or infrastructure projects. We've also pulled out resource and exploitation rights, so to do with natural resources such as minerals or forestry licenses, as well as relevant legislation or policies related to resource management or exploitation. And lastly, Maori interests, where I focused on the memorials with some relationship to Maori land ownership or any legislation or policies explicitly relating to what I call Maori interests in land, such as treaty settlements or change in the Maori land status. And there are many different more categories: leases, interests, registered retirement villages, unit, title, body corporates. There's all sorts of things going on in the data. So this one here is one I didn't talk about, and that's focusing on site development and spatial planning. So organisations involved in infrastructure, land or property development generally benefit from having a good understanding of the legal characteristics that affect their site or sites of interest. But with this version of the memorials now being presented spatially, we can show a clear picture of one or several potential factors at once that apply not just to the site of interest, but also all surrounding properties, neighbourhoods, or where relevant, entire regions. So I've grouped some of these into what I call the site development group, and that incorporates memorials associated with building line restrictions, fencing covenants, party walls, height restrictions, hazards, limited access sites. Those are presented in the map on the left, showing a number of those subcategories in a anonymous section of Auckland. Apologies for the need to squint at the legend, but I'm sure you can take a look at the presentation recording to interpret some of those sites. The one on the right, section of South Auckland, where I've filtered the memorials to just show those that are easements associated with electricity and power supply. The maroon line showing the route of a high voltage transmission line running through the Hanuas. And so I think it's actually electricity, it might be gas actually. No, I think it's electricity. So the easements taken from memorials and presented spatially may be of use to utility companies needing to audit their assets to make sure that they traverse title which have the appropriate easement interests registered. What else can we do? So the memorials data can be used for auditing completeness or accuracy of other authoritative data sets. We pull out information about environmental conservation memorials and group those into a category. So pulling out the title with land reserve or environmental covenants, e.g. national parks or subject to Reserves Act 1977, and all the other myriad environmental memorials. Remember, this is for every title. This is not just showing up reserves and covenants on public land. So you're not just necessarily having to deal with DOC data sets or local government data sets where there are reservations that you want to see on a map. We're pulling out all noted memorials on all titles, available again in a map presentation form. And the image you can see on the screen actually shows 3 sites where the memorials are recording information about reservations, so subject to Reserves Act 1977 or Crown Forest protective covenants, which aren't recorded in the the public data set. So DOC doesn't have that information, yet we can pull it out of the memorials data. This third set of examples is focusing on what I call Maori interest groups and Maori interest group layers. In New Zealand, we have lots of different varieties of land types, so general land owned by Maori, Crown land reserved for Maori, Maori customary land, etc. And status orders usually recorded in the memorials can be used to determine where some of that title has changed. And in the example here, I highlight on the left the memorials that I've picked out, 3 examples where, if you look at the example on the right, that the screenshot on the right is from the Maori Land Online site. I think it's called Pataka Whenua now. And that site isn't actually presenting 3 examples of land where the LINZ memorials are saying that the land is Maori freehold land. So it's a potential shortcoming in the official presentation of data. Quite interesting. And this last example is showing on the left a sub-layer within the Maori interest group category where I focused just on treaty settlement locations. So memorials often record information about treaty settlements against the title, particularly when it's associated with Rights of First Refusal, which is a characteristic of some settlements on Crown land. So again, on the left, all the different colours are representative of the different groups that are going to benefit from that or can benefit from that particular settlement. And on the right, what I've done is actually done some analysis on those sites to show as a convex hull extent the different treaty settlement areas and sometimes the overlaps between those different areas, which can sometimes be somewhat contentious. But anyway, this treaty settlement data segues nicely into the work that we at GBS did to help Kāinga Ora undertake looking into the Kāinga Ora's Crown obligations relating to treaty settlements. And for that, I'll pass over to Kirsten from Kāinga Ora to better explain that story.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
Awesome. Cool. I'll just share my screen now. Work. Waiting. Here we go. Awesome. So for those of the people here that do not know who Kāinga Ora is, we're the country's largest social housing landlord. We've got over 75,000 properties and we provide homes to over 190,000 New Zealanders. We've been steadily increasing the supply of our homes in recent years with over 13,000 new homes delivered. And as an urban development agency, we're enabling, facilitating and delivering tens of thousands of market, affordable and state homes across the country. We do this by working with iwi public and private sector partners and through best practice urban planning and design. We're also ensuring that the neighbourhoods in those homes have infrastructure and amenities that make them a great place to live. The Ben's already introduced who I am. I've been at Kāinga Ora for almost 7 years. It was Housing New Zealand at the time when I started. And I've been able to see the GIS practice go from 1 person through to about 4 at the moment, which is quite exciting. Just go to the next slide. So bookending Mark's slides, as he said, I've got a real world example of how we've used the LINZ memorials to help us work out what land we've got that has been tagged with the right of first refusal. But first, some background setting and some explanations of definitions. So I think Mark mentioned as well that Crown agencies hold land and property. This is to help their functions and objectives. It's companies, agencies like defence, education, or in our case, housing. And when the Crown has reached a treaty settlement with an iwi group, that land is held by the Crown agencies, but it has an RFR or right of first refusal put against it. Those RFR statements are put against the memorial, and in the middle of my slide you can see an example of a record of title with a memorial on it. I've redacted other information because of privacy with Kāinga Ora, but the main thing that you need to see is the Ngāi Tahu claims document information at the bottom anyway. The other background we had was in 2020, the Urban Development Act came into being, and that had a clause where it stated that we weren't allowed to initiate, facilitate or undertake an urban development project on RFR land. Now, what's important to know is that not all Crown land is subject to an RFR. There's no one size fits all, and they all may operate in different ways. Slide. The purpose of the Urban Development Act was to facilitate urban development that contributes to sustainable, inclusive and thriving communities, which, if you've seen the vision of Kāinga Ora, kind of really dovetails into what that's about. However, how were we supposed to work with that Urban Development Act? Well, obviously we need to be good treaty partners. That's part of Te Tiriti. And we need to engage early and have meaningful engagement with Māori. The people working on developments, and some of them are on this call, so I recognise a few names, they need to carefully consider what is required in the context of each of their developments. Practically, that meant that there was needed to be a check of the record of ownership or certificate of title for any references to a treaty settlement. It also meant that any of the relevant treaty settlement deeds had to be sorted through and read through. And it also meant that there was a check with Te Arawhiti needed. Obviously, we've got 75,000 homes. We need a quicker way of working that out, or at least cutting through the easy ones and creating a list of assets and of homes that need a closer review. We needed a visual view of RFR land. We needed to be able to see a complete picture across the whole of New Zealand. And we also needed to review our existing internal information. In our internal databases, we have a flag that states whether a property of ours has a right of first refusal attached to it, but we needed to QA that data. The reason we were doing this is because we needed to reduce the time needed in the initial stages of briefing a development, and we needed to be able to assist with the investment planning of our homes. You can see the map on the right shows the results of the analysis that GBS helped us with. And you can see that the triangles were showing that our internal data is saying that there's an RFR or a treaty settlement is associated with that, but LINZ doesn't. So we need to go and check that. And then there's the reverse. There's the ones where LINZ says there is a RFR on the title, but we don't have it in our internal information. And this just shows a closer view of a couple of areas. Obviously, the left one's on Hamilton, where you can see that there's, according to LINZ, there is a number of titles that have treaty settlement in their memorial, but we don't have that recorded in our internal data as yet. And on the right hand side, you can see there's the opposite, where we record that there is something on the memorial or something on the title, and LINZ doesn't. It's possible that the one on the right is because in our internal data we record manually things about treaty settlements as well. We also record ones that aren't quite in the memorials, quite ratified or agreed. So we just need to go in and check that. And that's what our next steps are. We need to manually check and understand those results. Then we will need to update our authoritative database for the Kāinga Ora assets. And as I said, there will be a few people on the call today who will be sending me emails right now saying, when can I have that data? And then we need to make this available to the teams that are making early investment decisions about the homes we manage. That's it from me. There's information, if you want some more information, there's contact details for both myself and Mark on the page. But otherwise, I will hand back to Ben, or if there's any questions.
Hi, thanks. That was fantastic, both Mark and Kirsten. A really great insight into sort of the practicalities of rights of first refusal across that substantial holding. I noted earlier that Dale Nguyen had a hand up during Mark's
she's one of the ones that's going to be sending me emails as soon as I finish this presentation.
Did you want to ask a question now, Dale, or save it for the email?
Sorry, Ben, it was by accident. So,
oh,
good. I talked to Kirsten later. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. And unfortunately, Zen from the Māori Land Court wasn't able to make it today. He's on our invite list, but not in the audience. So it's interesting to see from Mark's presentation the things that weren't visible in Pātaka Whenua, and something to follow up. A question from Carl in the chat: how do we explain the difference between LINZ, Māori Land, and Māori Land Court parcels?
I'll try and answer that and say that I can't explain the difference. All I can do is look at the particular text in the memorial, extract that from LINZ, check that its status is that it's a current memorial, and cross-reference it against the Māori Land Court parcels, which is also published as a service. You can do an overlay analysis in GIS and find out where there are differences between the two sites or two sets of data, and then highlight those data discrepancies. And I'd suggest that that's one of the purposes that I'm trying to push, is that this classification of data allows us to audit the difference between the two data sets. How and why they got different, well, that's a matter of process between those two different parties, LINZ and the Land Court, I would suggest.
Sorry, Cal.
And I think I can certainly speak for some colleagues here at LINZ that'd be interested to see that that audit results as well, to understand discrepancies between our Land Online and Pātaka Whenua, because there is regular interaction between those two systems, so they should be mostly aligned. David Brown has asked, when data mining, did you have much issues with typos in the data?
Yes, it's as simple as that. Millions of records manually entered. Obviously, there are all sorts of variations of text spelling, but it's more around the variations of the text itself. Like an easement could be a right of way to use, or a right of passage, or below a subsurface sewer rights, or waste space water rights. You know, all the different variations need to be handled in the mining process, and I'm exploring the use of AI tools now to try and get around some of those issues, actually, which is on a whole other hour's presentation probably.
Yeah, the hazards of a free text field. Okay, and so that's when's the presentation on using the AI? Final last question.
I haven't got a presentation, but certainly feel free to reach out and I can talk through one-to-one about what I've done. Maybe at next year's ESRI conference if Eagle let me do that talk.
Fantastic, look forward to it. Fantastic. Okay, thanks, Mark and Kirsten. We'll move on to the next item in the agenda. Feel free anyone to reach out to Mark and Kirsten with questions, especially colleagues, firing emails internally. And I will queue up the next presentation now. So it's the first of our LINZ presentations today. As Mark mentioned, and I mentioned earlier in the agenda, going into a 101 on memorials, titles and memorials, and how those memorials get into those titles that Mark and Kirsten showed in their presentation. And we've got Patrick Griffin from our property rights team, a principal titles lead in our property rights team, sharing with us today. He's joined LINZ back in 2007 and has worked in both regulatory and operational roles. And he came to us with a conjoint degree in law and social sciences as his background, and he's been a valued member of LINZ since then. Patrick, are you there?
Yes. Would you like me to share, or you've got the?
Yep. No. If you share from your end is
Yep.
the easiest way
Cool.
to go. Yep.
Great. I'll just put this through. Okay. Hopefully everyone's able to see that.
Yes.
And hear me. Okay. Great.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much, Ben, for the intro. Yeah, so my name's Patrick, role of the Principal Titles Lead within the Property Rights Group here at LINZ. So today the topic that I'm talking about memorials, and you would have heard a bit from the other presentations about them, are kind of going back to more of that fundamental framework creation perspective in terms of the register itself. So I've called it frameworks and processes which contribute to the creation of records of title and their memorials, basically because they're sort of interchangeable, and it's good to sort of cover that all at once. So it's just really, we're probably familiar with the titles, what they show at high level. It's just that high level overview of the frameworks. And at the end, I'll get into more of those mechanical aspects of the system, which feed into how we get to those products, and hopefully it provides some insights and understanding. And so if I just go to my next slide, oops, no, it's not. Okay, there we go. Framework. So brief agenda, our framework And hopefully, yeah, it doesn't get too boring. It's just a bit of that sort of legislative background, all that kind of thing, before moving into the new Land Transfer Act 2017 and some of those changes. So a bit of history, bit of context, before then moving into Land Online, that sort of modern environment, covering off a few of those key terms and definitions that we use, I guess, internally, and when we're handling these things, as well as some of our conveyancers and solicitors and surveyors. And then at the end there, I'm just sort of looking at sort of dealings as a basis for memorials with some examples, which I think those will be quite useful to give a bit of context. Okay, so but just move on to the next one. So yeah, going right back, I guess, for our framework, we've got this deed system from 1840 through to about 1870, and in this sort of environment, we had the Crown Grant was registered to start that chain of title and that ownership, and so of course we had the purchasers had to search back through all of those chains to get the sort of full story there. There wasn't a requirement for registration to be recorded, so but if you didn't, the impact was possibly a loss of priority or a subsequent registered deed if you didn't do that. So it was kind of quite a different mechanism to how we have now, but it's a lot of similarities as well. It was essentially a book of consecutive list of instruments or things that we have registered, and I guess over time they eventually did become quite large and complicated, required some careful, I guess, research, and then for some sort of that tracing back of documents to understand them. And so yeah, so that's kind of a large bit of history, and we look at what we compare to Land Online now. So if we go into the next one, then we then, from sort of 1870, we had this thing called the Torrens system. And so that was introduced, and I guess essentially it was a more formal means of recording. It was that compulsory registration. So, and there was a requirement, or essentially, that no legal interest may be created except by registration under the Act. So it kind of had this exclusive register thing. And then we had, I guess, kind of three main principles that underpin that. That the registrar is sort of accurately and completely mirrors that title, so it's accurate and it's complete. We had the curtain principle, that the title is everything and no one really has to inquire behind what it shows. And I think that's evidenced in some of the mechanics of the Act itself, in terms of no recording of trusts, except for certain exceptions. So the ownership is clear, and we're able to get a copy of a title, look at it and rely on that, and not have to sort of dig into other mechanisms of ownership and trust and things like that. And then there's that whole insurance principle, state guarantee of title and those interests that were registered. So it provides for losses incurred as a result of errors. So it's that whole basic principle of indefeasibility we've got there. Registered owner is absolute protection against any competing landowner or anything not registered because of those requirements. And it's also a principle which has been upheld in case law that goes back quite a long way to, I think, the original case of Fraser and Walker. Anyone familiar with it? Yeah, so that's sort of the Torrens system that we developed into. And then we go into the Land Transfer Act 2017, or actually we had Land Transfer Act versions of the Land Transfer Act, and largely the 1952 one, but recently 2017. So since the introduction of the 1952 legislation, this is the first major change to this real core legislation. And so if we think about the 52 Act, the 1952 Land Transfer Act, it was for the paper-based world. It was still functional, but didn't quite align clearly with the electronic world that registration has moved to. And so we've got a few points there, retaining that fundamental Torrens system that 52 Act has. Introducing, it had that digital aspect. We had, I guess, 2002 Computer Electronic Registration Act resulted in a sort of hybrid add-ons to the 52 Act. And so we've kind of, it combines a lot of that for the modern world. We had new terms and things like records of title, instead of things like certificate of title or composite computer register, which sort of indicated a computer aspect of title. And we're kind of saying, well, under this 2017 Act, the title is electronic, we're just calling it a record of title for clarity and not sort of that hybrid or add-on. And same with registered owner, a bit more rather than that proprietor terminology. It's sort of modernising a lot of that. And a key thing also, ability to withhold land ownership details that it brought in, protection of people's safety as well. So there's clear requirements around that, because obviously the register is publicly available and searchable. So there's quite clear requirements in the Act around when that can be used. Yeah, so that's sort of a key part of that Land Transfer Act 2017. And then Land Online, I guess, moving into the system that really the 2017 Act and Land Online sort of interrelate and support. So it supports those functions of the Land Transfer Act, and also including things like requests and communication that we might use with our parties, surveyors and conveyancers and solicitors who are lodging things. So it has this sort of add-on functionality, and also yeah, allowing the users to search, lodge, update titles, dealings and survey data digitally, real time, and obviously the digital cadastre defining those legal boundaries. It kind of split into those two workspaces, where the external for Land Online by those external users, which were for us external users, which are our customers and surveyors and conveyancers, transacting on behalf of their clients, and for surveyors as well. Territorial authorities for certifications to be able to certify and send those as well. And we also had the multi-land court and the register court orders that affect multi-land, so enabling them to have their own workspace to submit court orders and other things for registration, so that we can record matters that are requested. Yeah, and then of course there is the internal workspace for Land Online, which our customers don't see, that our processing staff would use when they receive work, survey plans, dealings, to then approve those plans and register them, create the titles and memorials we see. So a couple of key terms and definitions when we're talking about starting to think about dealings and transactions. So an instrument, when we talk about instruments, I might have heard it used before, essentially a document, well, in paper or electronic form, and it says includes a caveat document, e.g. a mortgage, a transfer, a discharge of mortgage. Yeah, the reason for saying includes a caveat document is that's how the Act words it, because caveats have a sort of slightly different terminology in terms of being entered. But essentially it's just a thing. So basic, it's like a mortgage or a transfer. So individually, those things are instruments. A dealing is a collection of one or more of those instruments that have been lodged for registration. So there could be one, it could be a simple transfer or a mortgage, or it could be various number, but collectively it was called a dealing. And then registration is the part where the processing and recording of those instruments, which then translate into essentially just translate into a memorial on a title. And then we have the memorial, which is that notation or summary of an instrument, notice, reservation or restriction. So in a lot of cases, right from that instrument being created through the dealing to registration to memorial, it will be the transfer or the mortgage that gets memorialized. And we say restriction because you probably heard in some of the other presentations around certain statutory restrictions or seen other things on there. So it also can be memorialized to indicate maybe it's a reservation if land has been transferred from the Crown to reserve minerals. Potentially it could be an easement recorded where there is a need to memorialise or record in the nature of that easement, whether it's to compulsory because council require it under the Resource Management Act, so we'll have a restriction which kind of notes that it is compulsory. So other things like that, so that's the kind of exception where things do get added, but normally it's quite clear if that's needed. And so I'll just quickly go on to, this might look a little bit more complicated, this slide, but it's kind of how dealings as a basis for memorials. So for standard sale and purchase, I've sort of split this into two just for ease. So if you are transferring or purchasing a house, the existing title, not creating a title already there. So 87%, roughly, it might be 88 now, around that mark, of all the dealings which are come through our system Land Online are auto-registered. And so those are quite often what we've got there, the discharge of mortgage, a transfer and a mortgage is a basic sort of setup of a dealing. So for example, a conveyancer at their end would create a dealing. We've got a number there given, basic one, 1 through to 8. And then they will prepare an instrument. So the first one in their dealing, they've got DM, which is the code, discharge of mortgage, and it will have 0.1. Following that, they will have the transfer, which is to transfer the ownership and the title, and that's the second one. It's got 0.2. Then we have the mortgage. So if someone has a mortgage, then it goes into 0.3. And so once it's all prepared and signed and submitted, Land Online will know the date and time of lodgement. As remember, the time of lodgement and priority is really key. What's interesting is that because there's this collection of instruments are within one dealing and the dealing is submitted, all those instruments will have that same date and time of lodgement. However, because they are within the one dealing, 1 through to 3, they also have to be done in order within that dealing. So by example, in this one, the transfer in this example will be transferring the ownership to a new owner. Therefore, the mortgage, the third instrument, will have a mortgagor, which reflects the transferee in this instrument, not the current owner. So it's sort of understanding when they're setting this up, that sequence of events. And so this is all just relating to an existing title. And of course, we have the other example. We've got a subdivision. This is a new title dealing, might have the same number, and it's going to deposit a plan. We've got an LT plan there to be deposited. And again, a number of instruments here. And we've got the transfer, which could be to do with a boundary adjustment, adjusting ownership of parcels, and then a request for new title. And then other instruments which will then flow on and have to be affecting any new titles which are issued at this point. So a little bit complex, but it's kind of, it gives you a bit of a feel for the complexities in terms of order of registration and these instruments within a dealing and how they come through. So if I just go through to the next screen, I've got an example here where I can just quickly run through a title and in some key parts. So we don't probably need to go to too much detail on some of the coat of arms and other things. We have the second point there, the title type. So we have business rules and Land Online, which can decide how things are dealt with for the particular title type. For there, the identifier, you'll find that in this one there's a number, which will happen for all modern titles. They were given a number. You'll see there are many existing ones out there that have prefixes for land districts, for Wellington WN, South Auckland SA, followed by a bracket and a number. So the land districts will be identified in that way, but new ones will have numbers. And we have the land registration district as well. The date issued is really important. So that's the date of issue of the title. And if we went back to that other example of subdivision, it will be at the point the date that the title is issued. And so that's when it will happen. And I've got next slide's actually got a historic title. This is the current one, which might show a bit more different view on it as well. And then, so prior references is really key. So when we are issuing a new title, if this was a subdivision, it would record the title that came before, so we know where it's come from, and obviously updated legal description if this was a new lot on a plan. Yeah, and estate type. So this is, in this one, it's fee simple. If there is a leasehold or other type, we would have that here. And we also have area, which we say is more or less, which is related to the area of the parcel itself, which is within the title. And legal description, which we described before. Obviously the owner's field there as well. In terms of the interest, you'll see there, if we go down to look at number 14, actually, mortgage 2. So this will be the dealing number, which has flown through to a memorial. And so it records that dealing number, mortgage 2, and we record who the bank is, the date and time, which is really key. And so this all started from, I guess, in that conveyancing workspace, and this hopefully would have auto-registered, but the memorial itself relates to that dealing and the data that's entered. So this is just a hopefully a good example of that. And you can see by current interest, this is a current title. It shows everything that you would need on the face of it to see the owners, to see what currently affects that title. And if I quickly go through to this next one. This is just an example of taking some bits out just for identification purposes. This is a historical record, and the difference is we will have original owners. They will be named there. I just took them out, and then the historical record is kind of like the audit trail of everything that has happened against this title. So we have everything recorded on the current view is recorded here, but we also have things like who it was transferred to, if something was added on and then taken away, a discharge of mortgage, for example, or so it's kind of that full record, which you don't need on a current view because we don't need to know what's removed if it no longer exists. So that's where that kind of historic title can be quite key for looking at that chain of ownership and other things to get a feel for what's happened on the title. And also you'll notice up here, another key point in this one, we've got constituted as a records of title under the Land Transfer Act 2017. A lot of existing titles, well, the ones that are in place at the time when that new act came into force, they might have been called computer registers or other things. And so because of this new act, we went through and we've actually updated the system to identify that this occurred and what time that happened. So it is a record of title. Yeah, so that should be everything from me. I can, yeah, if there's any questions, I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Patrick. There's just one question in the chat so far about sharing the PowerPoint, and yes, we can share the PowerPoint after the recording. Is the calculated area, is it the calculated area or the surveyed area that is recorded on the title?
Yeah, so I guess if we're talking about a new subdivision, you know, the plan's prepared and the surveyor will sort of calculate the allotments, which will then flow through to that title based on the survey's calculated area. So calculated based on survey, I guess. You know, there's some existing titles historically which may, you know, we do say more or less because parts get taken out, but I would say that in most cases, where if the land has been surveyed, it's been calculated by survey. I guess it depends on the nature of the title, but yeah.
And then there's just a question on what standardization of memorials is being looked at. I'm not sure if that is in the backlog of things as part of modernizing land online to introduce some standardized text options for memorial, for example.
Yeah, standardization of memorials. Yeah, well, there should be, I guess, in how they're recorded, the information itself should be clear in terms of the type of interest or instrument registered and the time and the details, and the instrument itself can be viewed to really view what has been registered itself, and so the memorial is a reflection of that. But yeah, if there's there should be, in a lot of cases, largely standardized, but you know, I acknowledge there may be some slight differences and when we're looking at it across our data and some of the wording and things like that. So I'm sure that's something that we can look at going forward if there are discrepancies. Yeah.
I just see there are a few more questions coming through the chat, and maybe Patrick, you can answer some of those while we go on to our next presentation, just on the interest of time.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Sure, and yeah, we'll answer those in the chat or get back to those people after. So I'll just queue up our last presentation for the day, and we have got Nick Donnelly from our Geodesy team presenting on the connection of quasars to property data. Nick is a principal geospatial specialist at LINZ, where his role is focused on delivering the software and technology to support New Zealand's fundamental spatial infrastructure. This includes supporting the infrastructure here in New Zealand that feeds data through into the global positioning, navigation and timing systems upon which we all rely. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Tēnā koutou katoa. Alrighty, hopefully that is coming through.
Yes.
Cool. Alrighty, so I guess we're just changing gears a little bit here to talk about some of the what you might call underlying infrastructure that really feeds into all accurate spatial data management and positioning that we do in our modern society. So there's a bit of technical detail here, but the point is not really to get across the technical detail. Hopefully it's just a bit of interest, bit of background, and to see how the likes of property data is at the end of a fairly long chain of fairly complex interacting systems that enable us to deliver that level of accuracy that we all come to expect. So we'll get right into it. Starting at the very beginning, 6 billion years ago, we have these objects called quasars, which are out in deep space. What they are is essentially mini galaxies have a black hole at the center of them. What sometimes happens is two galaxies collide, those black holes combine to form a supermassive black hole. All of that energy that gets released as an electromagnetic wave or a radio signal. That radio signal travels many billions of light years across the universe and eventually gets picked up here on Earth, for example, here in New Zealand. Well, that might be all pretty interesting, but what's the point of that? Well, the thing is that these quasars are so far away that even though they're basically really massive objects, they can be treated as a fixed reference point. And if we think about the Earth, it's a really dynamic system. Everything on Earth to some extent is moving. Earth itself is moving in the solar system. Our own solar system is moving around the galaxy. So actually that fundamental problem of how do you get a fixed reference can be quite neatly solved by using these very far away objects. For those who are a little bit familiar with surveying infrastructure, the traditional black and white beacons that are still on the tops of some hills is the same sort of concept. So there's a technique called very long baseline interferometry, which we use to measure these signals coming from space. The key point here is you need a couple of antennas, typically on different continents, and they measure the same quasar at the same time, very precisely measure the time difference from between when a part of the signal reaches each of those antennas. And by very precisely knowing that time difference, you can calculate the distance between those two antennas to an accuracy of a few millimeters over thousands of kilometers. Very long baseline interferometry feeds into something called the global geodesy supply chain. So all of this information gets fed through to various international analysis centres, which turns them into products that can be used. And an example of such a product is a global geodetic reference frame, sometimes also called a datum. WGS 84, for example, that GPS uses would be an example of one of these global reference frames. There's a whole lot of different techniques that go into creating it. Perhaps the global navigation satellite systems, such as GPS, is the one that most of us will at least have heard of. Some of the others are a little more exotic, and there's the very long baseline interferometry there as one of those four fundamental techniques that go into the creation of the reference frame. So New Zealand has one of these antennas up at Warkworth, just north of Auckland. In fact, there's two on the same site. There's a 30-metre antenna and a 12-metre diameter antenna. This is the 12-metre telescope, which is actually more useful for making the sorts of observations to these quasars that we're looking to make, because a smaller antenna can actually move around much more quickly, because the way it works is over a 24-hour period. We're wanting to observe lots of different quasars, as I mentioned, all at the same time as our colleagues internationally, so we can compare the results. So these are, relatively speaking, fairly fast-moving antennas that will observe in one place for maybe 2 to 5 minutes and then move on to the next object that they're observing. The observatory itself needs to be connected into the system by survey observations. And so this is just a few images from the connection survey that we do to tie this antenna into the GPS GNSS system, which is then used to essentially distribute the reference frame or distribute the datum across New Zealand. We often are observing with our colleagues in Australia, so there are 3 sites in particular in Australia that we frequently observe with. Also one over in South Africa that where we try and form a network with. That's just another image of a surveyor out making the observations to get the connections into the antenna. So, as I mentioned, we use GNSS to transfer, if you like, the accuracy that's provided by the Warkworth station all around New Zealand through the geodetic system via those global geodetic reference frames. And so that goes directly into land parcels. So surveyors, when they define a property boundary, they are making connections between the geodetic and cadastral system to define those parcels of land. And the image here is from our land on line system, and the picked lines going between the various triangles. That's showing the observations or vectors that surveyors have observed in the system that connected into that geodetic system. And then from parcels, they are a key constituent, or they feed into the property system, particularly in terms of helping with the spatial definition of understanding the extents of a property, and so that then becomes another link in that global supply chain. So, in summary, this is something that has really become more of a focus over the past few decades. Perhaps 30 years ago, it didn't matter so much that property data was only spatially accurate to 200 metres. I mean, I should say that's in an absolute sense. Your accuracy relative to your neighbour has always been fairly accurate in the New Zealand system. But what people are wanting to do now is overlay property data with observation data, aerial imagery, and they're really wanting it all to be able to match up to a couple of decimeters, often even better. What that requires is a really accurate global reference frame that is well tied in to international systems and is compatible with technology such as GPS or GNSS. And the space observations made in New Zealand directly contribute to this global reference frame. In part because of New Zealand's geographic location in the South Pacific, we can make observations here that really strengthen the geometry across the entire globe. So that's been a very quick overview, but hopefully that's just give it a bit of an idea or a background into some of the infrastructure that sits underneath not only property data, but all spatial data. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I'm just conscious of time. Do you have time to hang, or do you have to go straight to something after this, or do you have to, are you able to hang back?
I can stay on if there are any burning questions.
Questions, yeah. So if, we are up to that 2:30 mark, and if you do have to go to something, please do go. But if you want to hang back and ask questions, please do. I just had a question in terms of, so recently that Warkworth Observatory was run until recently by AUT, if I recall right. So what has been involved in taking over the running of that site from AUT?
Yeah, so you're quite right, Ben. The site was established by AUT primarily as a research and teaching facility as part of their radio astronomy course. For various reasons, a couple of years ago, they had a change in direction and no longer required the facility. But as I guess just been explained, the observations being made there were really critical. So working with a company out of Southland called Space Ops New Zealand, they run a site down at Aotearoa near Invercargill, which makes these sorts of, satellite observations. We're able to work with them. They have actually taken over the Warkworth site and make the observations, in this case under contract to LINZ. So it's been a real learning curve. It's been been something quite new for us at LINZ. It's been quite new for Space Ops, but obviously really pleased that not only have we been able to continue making the observations that are so critical, but hopefully we're working towards getting it into a longer term, more sustainable state so that we can make sure that these observations continue long into the future.
Awesome. There are a couple of questions in the chat now as well. Are different parts of New Zealand moving at different speeds relative to Warkworth?
Yeah, absolutely. So Warkworth is essentially part of the stable Australian plate. So that's moving in a very regular way. So all of New Zealand's movements overall are about 5 centimetres per year, give or take a centimetre or two. So that's kind of the overall level of variation if we forget about earthquakes and other deformations. Yeah, that's so relative to Warkworth, absolutely. And we can make those measurements with the GNSS or the GPS, and so we can get very precise measurements. So they will alter both in terms of the exact direction of the movement, depending on whether you're mostly on Australian plate or Pacific plate or like Wellington, right in the middle between the two of them. But yeah, it's typically at that 5 centimetres. But yes, if you're looking for centimetre accuracy, then absolutely you do need to be accounting for the fact that different parts of New Zealand are moving at different rates. And we do provide deformation models and other tools that people can use to do that if they need to.
Terrific. And then what's the summary now of interplate deformation rates? For example, East Cape versus Wellington. I think you, yeah.
So East Cape is really interesting, and I'm happy to follow up offline, but one thing with East Cape, which some people will be aware of, is there's a lot of these slow earthquakes that impact that part of the North Island. And so much of the North Island, but including the East Cape, Gisborne type area, it really depends, are we in the middle of one of these slow earthquake events? Now, again, the variation is at the 2 to 3 centimetre level, but I'd have to look at the actual numbers to give a confident answer. But yes, East Cape and Wellington are moving differently, but the differences would be at the level of 1 to 2 centimetres per year, just to give people an idea of the level of difference we're talking about, which for most people, if they're talking about accuracy between those two places, 1 or 2 centimetres doesn't matter too much for most applications, but for some it does.
And I suppose we've been mainly talking about lateral movement, but there'd be some horizontal as well.
So so I've been talking, when I say 5 centimetres, that's very much the horizontal lateral movement. You're right, New Zealand gets a lot of vertical movement, particular areas like the topovolcanic zone, Central North Island, which impacts places like Taupo, Rotorua. Vertical movement is a particular challenge because it can vary greatly over even quite a short distance. So there's different techniques we use to try and get a handle on that vertical deformation, including satellite radar measurements and other bits and pieces. But as a general rule, tectonic motion is outside of earthquakes, mostly horizontal. I generalise a bit there, but there's other geophysical phenomena that definitely have a greater impact in the vertical, and that can be a real challenge for engineers working in those areas.
That, I guess, links into, we've got that part of the 3D coastal mapping work program is to upgrade and establish new GNSS beacons at tide gauges around the country, so to help that vertical model.
Exactly, because the vertical does come into questions such as, well, is the sea level actually rising, or is it that the land is sinking, or is it a bit of both? And so it can be really important to try and distinguish the various mechanisms to understand actually what is causing an observed change. So that's right. We're in the process at the moment of installing some new permanent GNSS stations, essentially where we already have tide gauges, so that we can help tease apart those, or the vertical land movement, so we can help distinguish that from sea level change, for example.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Nick. And there's no more questions in the chat, and we're 5 minutes over time, but just wanted to, this will be all captured in the record, so that gets shared. So thank you, everyone that's been able to hang back and hear those questions answered. Yeah, and I guess that just leaves me to close with our closing karakia, and then wish you all the best. So bear with me while I bring that back up. Next slide. All right, tamata tātou, kua e te kaupapa. Ka rea nā hua, ka rere nā arawai, kua mau te mātauranga, hai arahina nā mahi o toitu te whenua, kia tau te rangimarie, ki runga I a tātou katoa, homie, hui tai kie. Thank you, everybody. And as I said, we'll share the recording once the transcription is tidied up and top notch in the coming days, hopefully by the end of the week. We'll share that through the mailing list and post it online as well for people to watch back later. And we stay posted for our next webinar as well to be announced in the next month or so. Thanks again. Ka kite, have a great day. And thank you to all of our presenters too.